Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the night. Though wise men know at their end that dark is right, because their words forks no lightning they, do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright, their frail deeds might have danced in Green Bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the night. And you, my father, there on that sad height, curse, bless me now with your fair stares, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the night. Welcome to Confluence, Episode 9. We continue our journey with scientists from around the country, from around the world, to share with us their science and their love for science and why they love that science. Welcome to Confluence, where life and science meet. Good day, welcome to another episode of Confluence, where life and science meet. Today we're going to talk to Dr. Diandra Leslie-Pelecky. And I think, normally, this is the point where you say, the person is from this university or from this institution, but this is a person of such remarkable breadth of things that I can't even describe her as one particular thing, right? So I'm just going to say her name right now, and as we get into the conversation, she'll talk about more about what she does. So welcome, Dr. Pelecky.
Thank you. When people ask what I do, I tell them I'm a mutt. I do whatever I need to do.
Well, the thing is, we'll get into this later on, a lot of us, regardless of what we choose for careers, we always have these side interests and have conversations with friends and say, in a perfect world, I'd want to do this and that. And you seem to have been able to find a way to kind of get everything in. So.
Oh, there's a whole bunch of things I haven't been able to do yet.
Right. Well, there's plenty of time. Well, welcome again.
Thank you.
So I want to start your scientific journey basically from when you were young and kind of get at what were the first influences in science that kind of got you interested in even the most basic of concepts. Talk about your days in Milwaukee, it was?
Yep. I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And the most important influences on my going into science were, like many people, my parents. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that they pushed me to go into science, it's that they never told me not to.
Okay.
So one of the things I remember most vividly is a very good friend of ours, Frank Zeidler, who was the mayor of Milwaukee for some period of time, had a telescope that he would bring over and set up in the backyard, and we would look up at the sky. Mm-hmm. And I remember that very vividly as being one of my earliest memories of doing science as a child.
Right. So, but you had you had these good experiences. You had the fortune of having a friend who had this equipment. But then you walked away from high school. What science-loving child walks away from the place where you'll actually learn science?
Someone who is very bored.
Okay.
I think one of the problems we have with our educational system is, if you go and work with kids who are in middle school, they are so enthused about science. They want to learn everything. They want to understand everything. You put equipment in front of them, their hands are all over it. By the time you get to high school, they're all trying to be cool and they don't want to do any of it, and they're much more interested in social things.
Right.
So I think we actually discourage kids a lot from going into science because of their experiences in middle school and in high school.
So what about those experiences can you point to that is sort of the root of the boredom? Because what you just described was more sort of from the kids' perspective, right? They have personality changes, but what about the curriculum and how it's taught, do you think makes it boring, and how can we change it?
I got really irritated when I was asked to go measure something that I already knew.
Okay.
So the example I gave in my talk was everybody who takes intro physics drops a ball and figures out that the acceleration due to gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. Okay, I knew that. I didn't need to drop the ball to find that out. And it was just irritating because it was like 3,000 people have done this experiment today already. Why am I having to do it?
Because you could be 3001.
Right? And I think that's something about being a scientist. I don't want to be 3001. I want to be first.
Okay. So you left high school. But
without a degree.
Without a degree. I'm sorry, I should point that out. But you still found a way to make it to University of North Texas for college at 16. it's hard for kids to get into college now with a high school diploma at 16, let alone one who was a dropout. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I had already taken the PSATs. I don't know if they still, do they still have PSATs? I had taken the PSAT and I had scored well enough. And I'd gotten accepted to 2 places, University of North Texas and Texas A&M. And my mother had gotten transferred to Irving, Texas, which is near Dallas, near North Texas. And I thought it was extremely unfair at the time that she would not let me go on my own at age 16 to Texas A&M and live by myself. But she made the decision I was going to North Texas where she could keep an eye on me. In retrospect, this was a very good decision.
Why do you say that?
Well, when you're 16, I mean, with all those temptations.
Right.
Yeah.
So the point here is Texas A&M has way more temptations than University of North Texas. All right.
Well, the point being away from home.
Right.
You know, having the support of your family, having people on those days when you come back and you've done badly on a test and you're ready to say, I can't do this, having people around you who say, it's a one-time thing, you can do this, is very important.
Okay. So speak a little bit about that, because I'm thinking that when you were at University of North Texas, this was a time when women in science, let alone women in physics, wasn't a very popular thing. And at least some of the reports, you know, some colleagues of mine talk about is the implicit or explicit discouragement that at that time women had to go through if they wanted to pursue that. Is that something you experienced? And if you did, you know, how did you kind of get past that?
So I think I came of age when most of the faculty had figured out there were things you just don't say out loud, even if you're thinking them. I did have one instructor.
Oh, that age came?
You know, it's almost worse now because people know there are things you're not supposed to say. And it used to be that people would just say it, and you knew this person is not going to support me. And now they know I can't say that, I'll get in trouble. I had one professor who said, I don't think I want to spend time teaching you this because you're just going to go off and get married and have kids and you'll never use it. But that was one professor, one time. I had a lot of really supportive professors. I think it was much more implicit. It's that moment when you're sitting in a class and you look around and you realize, I'm the only woman in the room. Why is that? And that just, it's a little disquieting. And so there's nothing aggressive or anything anyone did. It's just uncomfortable because you realize you're different.
Do you feel that kind of motivated you more?
I'm not sure if it motivated me more. To some extent. So my mother was the only girl on the Little League team when she was small. And that was much before, you know, that was 1940 something. So my mother had always told me there was nothing I couldn't do if I wanted to do it. So I think a lot of that came through. Parents don't necessarily have to encourage their kids to go into science, but they have to make sure they don't discourage them.
All right. So, but you double majored in philosophy as well as physics. Did you see those two disciplines intersecting both during your time taking the classes as well as after you graduated and then sort of went on to PhD?
They didn't intersect from the perspective of the courses. The biggest problem was scheduling, because I remember Dr. Anderson saying, I already checked for conflicts with math and chemistry and biology, and now you want me to check for conflicts with philosophy? I do remember that. I think where philosophy was most important was in teaching me how to organize my thoughts and express them. Because in philosophy, clarity of thinking, clarity of explaining is really important. And we don't put as much emphasis on that in science as I think we should. So the philosophy aspect gave me that training in becoming a better writer. Right.
So did that technique kind of inform the way you approached physics and approach some of your experiments or approach some of your communication aspects of your work? And if so, how so?
It made me aware that what you see is very strongly colored by what you expect to see. If you go into a situation expecting to see something, it's confirmation bias, but not just that. One of the examples you hear is before women started doing primate research, they had characterized male-male interactions and male-female interactions. No one had looked at female-female. Not because anyone said, I'm not going to look at those, they're not important, but because it just hadn't dawned on people. So, you know, it's just familiarity, seeing what you expect to see.
Okay. So, talk a little bit about your time at University of Nebraska. I think you were a postdoc there or a faculty member? Faculty member, correct?
I was a research faculty member and then a tenured.
Because I remember we talked about you were able to get into a lot of outreach work. That sort of where that part of your career started?
Well, outreach actually started in graduate school.
Okay.
And so when I was, I think, middle school, I had the fortune to go to a program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee called Science Bag. And it was a 1-hour show they put on Fridays and Saturday nights, different program every month, and it was for the public. And so I remember learning about rainbows. I remember learning about what happened to things after they die and they decompose and they come back again. I remember learning about snowflakes.
Right.
And that was very formative in my being interested in science, my asking questions. So when I was in graduate school, we were all sitting around at a bar, talking as graduate students want to do, thinking, we could probably be doing something more useful than sitting around at the bar drinking. And we got the idea of putting on our own shows like that. And so I started an organization called Science Theater, which is still going at Michigan State to this day.
Oh, yeah? Okay. And where was that held?
We went everywhere. We actually pioneered Science
so
Day
traveling.
at the mall.
Okay.
We took over the mall in Lansing and had science exhibits from not only Science Theater but other places. The Boy Scouts had something and 4-H had something, and took over the mall for a weekend and just imposed science on anyone walking through that we could stop.
So let me ask you, because a lot of our students, especially our seniors, do a lot of, we encourage them to do outreach. It's actually a class that they take. And it's probably for the first time a lot of them realize how hard it is to translate a lot of the very technical things that they learn in class to people who may have never seen it. And part of that is sometimes there's an association with technical jargon, with difficulty, right? So it has to sound esoteric and you can't understand the words. And then all of a sudden you find yourself having to use everyday terminology to describe these things. Can you talk a little bit about how you overcame that challenge? So, especially as a grad student, what are some of the most difficult things that you had to do in terms of convincing a mall goer, I think that was the example you just gave, to understand very basic laws of physics?
You have to realize that interaction is not about you, the explainer, it's about the person you're explaining to. And so you have to get over I need to impress this person with how smart I am. I need to make sure that I use exact, precise explanation, and I don't leave out the fourth order relativistic corrections to this,
Why
that,
would you
and the
do
other
that?
thing. If you're focused on yourself as being on stage, being the big cheese, you will fail. What you have to be focused on is eliciting an interaction between you and the other person. And so, when you're talking to someone, you get that feedback. You can see that person's understanding or they're not. So there's always a moment when you're teaching, when you see a student's eyes go blank, right? We know, I've just lost that person. Right. The advantage of doing outreach and talking one-on-one is I can tell, when I'm explaining to you, I can tell the moment you're not getting it. And then that tells me, okay, I got to go back and think about how I'm explaining this. Give you an example. I wrote we did little skits, and they were actually scripted so that we were sure we had the right explanations. I did this wonderful skit about why balloons stay blown up, and talking about the molecules and how they get warmer and they expand and colder and they contract. Did the entire thing for a third grade class. Any questions? Little third grader raises his hand and goes, "What's a molecule?" And I hadn't even conceived that third graders do not learn about molecules yet. So that one-on-one, that talking to people and getting the feedback is just absolutely critical.
What was the most difficult thing you had to explain?
Oh, gosh. What's the most difficult thing I've had to explain? In science theater or in general?
In science theater. I'm sure in general it would be a harder question.
I think the most difficult thing I ever had to explain in science theater was color and light. Because, if you're looking at light mixing, it's very different than if you're looking at paint mixing. Because in one case you're seeing transmitted light, in the other case you're seeing reflected light. It's very subtle, and it takes a long time to explain. But, you talk about, you put all the colors together of light, you get white. You tell kids, white light contains all the colors. Well, if you take all colors of paint and put them together, you get black. So how does that make sense? And it's really funny because the younger kids will pick that up immediately. When you tell them white light is all colors, they'll say, but if I put all colors of paint together, I don't get white, I get black. So explaining that, coming up with a good way to explain that was a bit of a challenge.
I'm sure you found a way. So you took this work to University of West Virginia?
University of Nebraska.
University of Nebraska, but then you were at West Virginia University afterwards, correct?
Yeah, I was only there for 3 years.
Okay. But then you made what seems, to those of us who are in grad school and kind of trying to figure out how we want to manifest our careers, you decided to leave a fully tenured position. So could you walk us through a little bit about your thinking about that decision, what led you to it, and kind of how you felt since then?
Been there, done that. On to something new. So, yeah, I went through assistant professor, associate professor. I got a career grant from NSF. I had funding from NSF, the Office of Naval Research, the Air Force, National Institutes of Health, all kinds of other places. I'd been through all that. And I realized that not a lot of people are good at communicating science. And the people who are tend to get into it utterly by accident. And I realized that I was probably more valuable to the world talking about science and bringing science to people who don't normally get it than I was writing more grants, writing one more paper, even training graduate students, which I view as the most important thing I did in my academic career, was working with graduate students. It just seemed to me that I found it more fulfilling, and I was doing something that not a lot of other people could do. A lot of people can do research in nanoparticles. A lot of other people are doing research in nanoparticles. Not a lot of other people can do what I'm doing.
Okay, so you feel your skill set, or maybe one of your skill sets that wasn't duplicated, was here, and this is sort of the best way to spend your time. Is that a good way to...
It's not only that my skill set is conducive to it, I find it rewarding. I find it important. Now, some of my colleagues, to put it bluntly, think I'm insane.
So that was my next question. What was kind of the reaction from your peers? Because there's this sort of, tenure is like this holy grail in universities. It's so hard to get, the jobs are so few, the road to get there is so difficult. The thought of somebody just walking away from that completely, I mean, I'm sympathetic to it only because culturally I kind of understand. But I just wonder if somebody who had to go through that thought process, like how did you then respond to your colleagues who may have seen that differently?
So it's interesting. The people who don't know me very well sort of looked on in horror. What are you doing? You're throwing away all this career. You're throwing away all this training. People invested time in you. We put money into you. The people who knew me well, when I told them, said, yeah, I guess I'm really not surprised because that's what you're really good at.
Right. Right.
So it's really important. You're rejecting something that people work long and hard to get. It's not easy to get a faculty position. It's not easy to get tenure. Walking away from it is really hard.
Right.
But for me, it's a question of being happy and doing what I feel will fulfill my heart.
Right. Do you think, and I'm asking this question only because I have colleagues who, are thinking about something similar, even though they're not tenured yet, but just from academia in general. And I always get a sense from them that it's kind of important for them to prove that they walked away on their own terms and not because it was too hard or they couldn't get it or they couldn't get a job or couldn't get tenure, just because there's that perception of failure from people who, like you said, don't know you. Was that an important thing to you at the time to prove that, look, I walked away from this because I wanted to, the end, not because I couldn't get grants or I couldn't do X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I actually walked away from a $1.2 million NIH grant.
Okay, that's so that is your own too.
Well,
where's that grant now?
But there are still people who will tell you the reason that I left was because I couldn't cut it. And I have an advantage that people at your stage of life don't have, which is that I'm a little older. And the older you get, the less you really care what other people think.
Right.
You really start realizing that there's a very small set of people whose opinions are important to you. They're the people you love and the people you respect. Right. And that may not include your colleagues.
So connected to that thought then, is this idea, and I know we talked about this yesterday, that it's not so much just the colleagues, right? To me, it's almost the system as well. It's kind of geared to and this is not just academia, in my opinion. It's med school, it's dental school. There's this sort of critical path that you have to be on. And if you, by your own volition, decide to sway from this path to do, a couple of years in Peace Corps or Teach for America or something just off of it, then, the brows start to furrow and people start thinking like, why aren't you in a seminar, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that there's something about the way the PhD system is set up that can change in a way that if people want to make that decision, they don't have to be so judgmental of themselves or so defensive about a choice, or maybe just a little bit comfortable with pursuing non-tenure track options?
That's a really tough question because you're asking to change an entire culture.
I am.
It would be like saying, well, let's change attitudes towards race in the United States of America. They're so deeply ingrained, they're not going to change except over time.
Right.
I think what you're doing when you make a decision like that is you're rejecting the culture. And you're saying your judgment is, this is the thing that one should do. And I'm saying, no, I'm going to do this.
Right.
So you are rejecting that culture.
Right.
Now, if my students would come to me and say, what I really would like to do is teach high school, I'll ask them some critical questions. Are you sure you want to spend your entire day surrounded by 16-year-olds? Because some of them, depending on their composition and sort of their own personal values, I would know might not actually like that. But it's their life. They have to be happy doing it.
Right.
If they take a job and they're miserable, it's not going to affect me at all.
Right. So there has to be a comfort level on part of the advisors for, to have their students pursue stuff that they may not necessarily know a lot about.
Well, but I, as an advisor, have no right to tell you as my student what you should or shouldn't do. It's your life.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But, even to take your point about race, it's not where we would like it to be, but it's certainly way better than it was in 1960. And maybe part of that had to do with some legal changes, so it became illegal to do certain things, and as things were sort of forced-fed into society, people kind of had to adjust. Maybe in a similar sense, maybe there might be some administrative things we can do to start kind of legislating almost that conversation to be different.
There are. So, for example, when Bell Labs broke up, a lot of the people who had worked at Bell Labs came to academia. So I know, for example, at the University of Florida, there's a lot of people who came from industry experience. Hiring people into academic positions who come from national labs, who come from industry, or even who are entrepreneurs. That opens this whole door for your students, because now there's someone they can go to and say, if I wanted to start my own business, how would I do it? And you don't even have to hire them.
Right.
As you're bringing people in for Confluence, bring in some people who are not academics.
Yeah,
Find some people. You must have alums who have started their own businesses.
We do. In fact, our last presenter was a National Geographic explorer. She was great.
So you have the power to do a lot of that, and bringing in people, asking to bring in people who have non-traditional careers, people who work for NGOs, people who are physicists who work for food companies, things you never would have thought physicists did.
Right.
That's change you can actually
Did you say
enact.
food companies?
Yeah. Somebody told me, I forget who it was. If they're in the room, I apologize. Somebody told me the best job description they had seen for a physicist was chocolate engineer.
That might be the best job description for anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, think of viscosity, fluid dynamics. I mean,
I guess you're right.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about NASCAR. Might be one of the most interesting parts of your portfolio. Actually, I take that back. I actually think the playwriting is one of the most interesting parts. But tell us a little bit about how you got involved with NASCAR, some of the work you did with them, and how you used that relationship to educate the public about not just NASCAR, but that area in general, physics in general.
Well, I mean, it honest to gosh was an accident, my getting involved in NASCAR. I was not a racing fan. I didn't understand why people thought racing was interesting. Very much like many of my colleagues who look at that and say, why are you doing this? And it's like going into a different world. It's a different culture. It's something I hadn't experienced before. Scientifically, it's fascinating because it's taking very basic physics, chemistry, engineering, and understanding the sport by virtue of understanding the science. And there aren't a lot of sports you can do that in.
Right.
And students will say things like, I never thought I'd get to watch NASCAR races during class. One of the drivers, when he wins, he stands on his window and does a back somersault.
Carl Edwards, I believe.
Carl Edwards.
Yeah.
Projectile motion. The people who work with Carl sent me a time-lapse photograph of him doing a somersault. It is a perfect parabola. I use it in my classes. I have my students calculate out what's the height of the car based on the path he takes.
Right.
How high did he go? How far did he land from the car?
Okay.
You know, that's
So
a
how does
real
he
life
achieve?
situation.
How does he achieve a perfect parabola?
That's physics. That's he can't not do a parabola.
Okay.
Anything you throw in projectile motion will be a parabola.
All right, well, there you go.
And it's perfect to the extent that you can measure it on a photograph.
Yeah,
It's not like perfect. I'm sure if we took air resistance into effect,
Right.
it would be off a little bit.
Yeah, my last physics class was about 10 years ago. You probably should teach me a few things. Have you ever seen the show Sports Science?
Yes. I have consulted for sports
Oh,
science.
you have? Okay. Tell us a little bit about that. Because I love that show. Because they do all the different sports, and they do everything from a running back to a baseball swing.
Yeah. They use a lot of the instrumentation that's available. And so, for example, if you see a hockey player run into the boards, how hard are they actually running into the boards? And so they actually go and measure those things.
Okay.
And so that's really nice because you can actually see the sensor, and they get the guy who's doing it they throw him up against the boards, and they use him as a test dummy, basically.
Right. So you told me you're going to start writing some plays?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well,
And
I think I told you.
Where should we get tickets?
I'm looking for investors. I'm going to be on Kickstarter soon, I'm sure. I started off as an undergraduate as a radio, TV, film major. And I got out of it because I did not want to spend my life begging for money and having people criticize my work. Now, if you think about what a physics professor does, you beg for money and people criticize your work. So I was telling people all my many years of being a physicist prepared me for rejection. And so writing plays, writing screenplays now, learning more about writing fiction. What NASCAR taught me was you reach people through their hearts, not their heads. I can go to you and say, it's really important that you understand energy because it's going to be a huge thing in the future, and we're going to have problems getting enough energy for our cars, for our houses. I can then go to people who say, well, NASCAR is wasteful, and I can say, calculate how much gas a NASCAR weekend uses. And you know what it is? It's like 3 seconds of what this country uses. That's something people remember. They will not remember all the facts I spew at them about energy. You reach people through their hearts, not through their heads. And so having fictional opportunities to show them not only the science, but what scientists do, who they are. I don't think people appreciate the passion you have for science. When you do research, you are in the lab 80 hours a week sometimes. You do it because you're passionate, not because you're an automaton in there making a measurement over and over. You do it because you are convinced there is something there you must figure out. And that's something people need to see, because they learn science, and they learn that Ben Franklin went out one night and stuck a key on a kite and discovered electricity. And we all know that's not how scientific discovery works. If you want the public to fund science, if you want the public to write their legislators and say, why aren't we giving NSF more money? Why aren't we giving NIH more money? They have to understand that scientific research is not a done deal. It is not something where I give you money, you go find a cure for cancer. It's I give you money, and you money, and hopefully one of you will come up with something that gets us closer. But you have to understand that before you understand why we need to put money into cures for cancer.
Let me ask one last question before we take questions from the students. And this is just something I've been wrestling with myself. When I read New York Times, Wall Street Journal, science articles, a lot of times, the accusations that some people make of science, and I've actually heard congressmen say this, is that we tend to be kind of wafflers by nature. Just in the sense that because we've been trained to kind of question everything, and everything's relative, and yes, these are my results, but this is a hypothetical scenario, and so the line between kind of unbiased scientific research and then advocacy, it tends to be a little bit far apart, because a lot of times the kinds of questions we ask in basic science are not the kinds of questions that lead to picketing on Capitol Hill. Yeah. So my question is, for scientists who just kind of have that passion to find a basic answer, what is your advice to them in terms of getting involved in advocacy? In other words, should all scientists be an advocate on some level, or should there just be sort of a subsection who are thus inclined to do that, to do it? What are the scientists' role in advocating for these principles for public knowledge, et cetera, et cetera?
So I am on the record as saying the best thing some scientists can do to improve the public image of scientists is to stay out of the public eye. Not everyone is good at that.
Right.
Some people, they cannot give you a simple answer. Those people who don't enjoy doing public advocacy, those people who don't enjoy doing outreach, should not be forced to do it. NSF has a rule that if you want a grant, scientific grant, you have to have a broader impact. So we have people reluctantly going into third grade classes and probably scaring small children.
Forever from science.
Yeah. Doing outreach is something that takes skill and talent, and people who do it well should do it, and people who don't do it well, or even people who do it well and don't enjoy it, shouldn't have to do it.
Right.
I subscribe to the principle of not wrong. I can explain something to you. It's not going to be entirely right, but I can't tell you something that's wrong. And journalists, they want simple sound bites. They want, Fred has just discovered a cure for prostate cancer. Not Fred has identified a protein that may give us a way to diagnose prostate cancer, and then we can treat it earlier and prevent it from killing someone. You have to figure out how do you make sound bites. You have to be comfortable. This is one of the things I got out of NASCAR. I met a lot of people who work in public relations. Scientists do really lousy public relations. And I learned a lot from those people about how you explain things, how you make them simple for people to understand, without preaching to them, without taking 5 minutes instead of 30 seconds. And
Right.
that's something, it's a skill. And if you want to do it, you should study how to do it. And a lot of professional societies are now offering opportunities for people to take workshops. So SUNY Stony Brook, Alan Alda has the Center for Communicating Science. They go out and do workshops. In fact, you guys should get them to come here. And they teach, what Alan Alda's thought is, if you use the techniques of improv, scientists will become better communicators. And so he has actors come in and teach scientists how to do improv.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's an approach. Look,
I would
nobody
love
else
to be
has
an
tried it.
audience.
It would be great fun to do. And what's it going to hurt if it doesn't work?
Okay. Well, I think I want to take a few questions from students.
So when he told me about the theater and everything, in high school I was actually really big into theater. And I actually get what you mean about the whole, in high school I felt like I was inhibited about science. So my thing about theater is, you did science theater, you did all that. How are you, because when I did theater, there was always a small message that came along with every play. Something came about. In Hamlet, you may think, oh, I just saw a play about a man killing his father's murderer, but in reality, you see a broader message. How are you relaying the broader message into this play? Because it's very difficult to actually get out that broader message.
It is. If you think of the broader message as being perhaps how scientists have a passion, you can show that many, many times over the course of 3 acts, right? One of the plays I've written has to do with the concept of hysteresis. And hysteresis is history dependence. What it means is if you take a material and you magnetize it, you put a magnet on it, it gets magnetized. Some materials, you take that magnet off, it loses its magnetization. Other materials, you remove the magnet and it stays magnetized. So everything depends on its past states. Well, that's sort of life, right? So you can use those kinds of metaphors. And it's the same thing with Hamlet. There's a metaphor, there's a story above the water that you see, that's what happens, and there's a story below the water that has the deeper meaning. And so that's part of what I'm learning.
So as an undergrad, I spent a lot of time testing and studying and preparing things for professors that evaluate me. But I find that it's really hard to sit down and evaluate yourself and see what you're doing and how you would grade yourself. How much time did you spend introspecting and just figuring out your life from your point of view?
That is an excellent question. At your age, I don't think you can evaluate yourself because it's very difficult to be objective. I'm one of the people who everything I do I hate. We're painting our house right now, and I can tell you every little last place I accidentally got paint in the wrong thing, and it drives me nuts. So I'm extremely hypercritical. You want to surround yourself with a group of people who will be honest with you, because those are the folks who will give you the opinions you need. So when you're being hypercritical and you're saying, oh my gosh, I can't do this, I must have quit graduate school 2 or 3 times a day, honestly. Something would happen, I can't do this, my experiment will never work. And I had people around me who'd come back and go, okay, you're overreacting, stop. And that's really important. As you get older, you'll get more perspective on yourself. And now I feel I'm a lot more comfortable getting criticism directly from people, and I don't take it to heart. When they criticize something I've written, I don't feel like, oh my gosh, I'm useless. I look at it and go, well, I can fix that. So a lot of it, and I hate to tell you this, is just as you get older, you will get more and more confidence. Being an undergrad is probably one of the worst times for questioning everything you're doing. But you need that introspection. Surround yourself with a support group, positive people that you can count on to tell you the truth.
You didn't, the whole point of confidence, I guess, to a degree, is not to talk so much about the technical aspect of your work, which I think you said was about 15 years or something of magnetic nanomaterials, if I'm not mistaken. 25.
Yeah.
I heard the wrong number. So in retrospect, would you have, do you think that those 25 years were well spent? Or do you think, since what you do outreach, it's NASCAR, right? So it's not exactly magnetic nanomaterials. It's pretty different. So do you think that in retrospect, that was kind of time wasted that you could have used doing something else?
That's a great question. No, it wasn't time wasted, because this is something I think is really important about graduate school. You learn to be comfortable not knowing where you're going, right? Most of life, we're comfortable when we know we do this step, this step, this step, this step. When you're doing research, you don't know if what you're working on is ever going to work, and you have to be comfortable with that. When you blaze a new trail, that's the one thing you have to have. You have to be comfortable saying, this may work, this may not work, I'm going to try it. Very few people have that. You get that from graduate school. You get that from doing research. I wouldn't go back and do anything differently. I really enjoyed the time I spent, most of the time I spent. There's obviously some parts I didn't like so much. I enjoyed the time I spent doing research. I like physics. I like magnetic nanoparticles. I still read Science magazine. I still look at papers. So I don't regret anything I did. I don't think you can look at your life that way. You can't look at it and say, I wish I had spent time doing this instead of this, because everything you've done so far makes you the person you are now, who is the person who's ready to go on to the next step. So nothing you do is ever wasted, except maybe the drinking. I may waffle on that one. But no, I don't regret any of the time I spent. If you could tell me you could go back and start writing when you were 21, I wouldn't have all the life experience I have now. I have so many things that have happened that I can talk about and write about. I wouldn't have that if I were your age.
So one thing that you advocated was that you went away from the path that everyone tells you should go down. It's not, and you even said it's not easy going down that path. So what made you, I know you said you had different things, but would you recommend that not all of us, but most of us try going down that different path, even though it may be not always beneficial, but sometimes consequential to our careers and everything? It's
not a question I can answer in general, because I may tell you right now you shouldn't do it, but 10 years from now you'll be ready. It really depends where you are. I want to emphasize, I did not all of a sudden one day come home and tell my husband, hey, you know what? I'm going to quit my full-time job and I'm going to write. We talked about it. We planned for 3 years because, of course, I had students I had to worry about. I had grants I had to worry about. I planned how I would save up the money so that I could afford to do what I wanted to do. You may decide, I'd like to start my own company. Well, you're not going to graduate with a bachelor's degree and go off and start it and become rich and famous. You're probably going to get a job somewhere, work 40 hours a week, and then spend all your weekends and evenings working on your company. So it really depends where you are in life. But look, everyone can go down that path, right? And do something new, because who knows what you're going to come up with. Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, you can just go down the list of people who have done these amazing things. None of them went down a path that already existed. And it's not for everyone, because I'll tell you, we went through financial planning like you would not believe to make sure that, you know, we wouldn't lose our house or anything because I'm doing this. I still lay awake at night worrying. Even though I know we're in really good shape, I still lay awake at night worrying about money. And that's a result of how I was brought up and how my family handled money. So there is some stress, and if you're not the kind of person who can handle stress, you don't want to go down that path because it'll make you very unhappy. So don't do it without thinking it through very carefully.
So as a grad student, I know research is a big thing. Would you ever consider possibly merging NASCAR and maybe like industry to go into research and try and fix something or improve on something?
So I have talked to people in NASCAR about how you might use nanoparticles in research or in NASCAR. And there are some ways, but I can't tell you about any of them.
Yeah.
I will tell you that there is quite frequently ads for companies in North Carolina that do non-destructive evaluation to try to understand, for example, coatings on parts and how those coatings fail. And that has implications not only for NASCAR, but also for aerospace, the automotive industry. So there's a lot of those things. But the other thing about getting older is you realize you're not going to get everything done in your life you want to get done, and you have to target it. And so you have to look and say, I could do all these things. Which one do I really want to do most? So that's not something that would be, say, in my top 3.
Fair enough.
You want to ask about MRI?
Okay, all right. So I'm currently a grad student in physics, and I'm dealing with fMRI, so brain imaging and whatnot. And I know that you were dealing with nanoparticles and MRI, so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, so magnetic resonance imaging works because you're detecting magnetic fields from nuclei, mostly in water. And nanoparticles create inhomogeneous magnetic fields. And so they distort the magnetic resonance imaging signal. So you can use it to enhance the signal. And so, for example, you can do things like if you attach a protein that would attach to, say, a liver, you can target the nanoparticles to the liver, do an MRI, and see where they are. Now, what we were doing was attaching chemotherapeutic drugs to nanoparticles and trying to target them to tumors. Because, of course, the problem with chemotherapy is that the drugs go all over your body. And chemotherapy drugs work by killing the fastest dividing cells, like your hair follicles, which is why your hair falls out. So we wanted to target them and keep them magnetically at the tumor. Well, one of the advantages of the nanoparticles is you could then do an MRI and see if the drugs were where they were supposed to be or not. Now, there's some really interesting things going on with looking at nanoparticles to actually look at chemical sensing. And so they actually take nanoparticles that will, they put 2 different proteins on them, and you're going to have to pardon me because I can't remember what the proteins are. But the proteins only bind when there's calcium present. And you know, calcium is a very important part of cell function. And so you can actually see chemical interactions via MRI that way. So I think that's an absolutely fascinating thing. If I were going to get back into it, I would go in that direction.
Okay. Do you think those nanoparticles could ever be, I guess, viewed in the brain?
Oh, yeah, they have been.
Okay.
I can show. I've done an MRI. I can show you my nanoparticles in a rat brain. We were trying to do stroke treatment, in fact.
Looks like I might be possibly going down that path, or at least asking my advisor if she'd be willing to go down that path.
It's a fascinating path to go down. There's so many neat things you can do in research right now that it's hard to figure out which one because there's just so many of them.
Hi. So my question is that if we progress more and more into the science field, would that make it also harder to educate the masses on where we are at? Or maybe it's better just to fill them in on the basics, but then leave them alone. And then my second question would be, would we be able to use technology today, the ones that we're making, to help educate the masses? For example, we have Facebook, Twitter, everything. As you said in your talk that you have Twitter and you see the effects of your teachings, would we be still able to use that effectively to educate the masses if we do choose to?
So let me answer the second one first because I've already forgotten the first one. You'll have to remind me of it. The National Academy of Engineering identified 10 grand challenges, and one of them is using the power of technology to individualize education. So one of the problems we have is the United States tries to educate a huge fraction of our population. And you put one teacher in with 30 students, and it's really hard. And I'm sure many of you have been in classes where there were 100 students in the class or 200. Using computers, we can specialize education. So for example, let's say you're interested in soccer and you're interested in ballet. Well, we're going to do angular momentum. I can program up lessons so that you get a lesson in angular momentum that talks about soccer and you get one that talks about ballet. Pardon me. That way we can engage kids a whole lot better and show them where things are relevant. So I think that opportunity, the opportunity to use the computers to do the one-on-one kind of tutoring that normally people used to do with each other, I think that's our biggest possibility for improving education using technology. I'm not sure how Facebook and Twitter are going to actually help with that, as much as I love Twitter. So remind me what the first question was. It's about educating the masses. And
as we progress in the science field, it does seem that the more we progress, the more complex it gets. So aren't we presented with the choices of whether to educate the masses or whether to just go so far that we can with it?
I don't think it's an either or. I think what you have to do is don't immerse yourself so far in your science that you don't talk to normal human beings. You know, have some hobbies, play sports, go out and, you know, get interested in cars, take up the guitar, do something like that. It is true that the further and further, the deeper and deeper you get in, the more and more specialized your vocabulary becomes. And you do become in jeopardy of only talking to this very small subset of people who share the exact same vocabulary as you do. You have to consciously work to not let that happen. Now, should you then go and explain to someone the fourth order relativistic quantum mechanical corrections to Newton's law? I don't think the average person needs to know that. I think we really have to think about what aspect of our work we tell them. So I would tell the average person, I'm working on ways to make chemotherapy better. Now, was that actually what I was doing? Not every day. I was looking at how do you attach the drugs to the nanoparticles and hold them there at a tumor using a magnet. I wasn't actually doing chemotherapy. But that was enough to tell people. And so when you think about your research, you should have a variety of levels of explanation. Start with the simplest one. If the people get that, you move up to the next one. But you should be able to do that. You should think about a 3rd grade explanation and a 6th grade explanation and a 9th grade and a 12th grade and keep going. But you have to consciously do that because you do stand to be in jeopardy of moving into a world that excludes a large fraction of the rest of the population. That's a very good question.
I really liked how you incorporated 2 bachelor degrees into your studies, and I was wondering what changes we could make in our academic culture to encourage PhDs to communicate their ideas not only to the mass public, but also to each other. Because as we specialize in our own fields, we might not know as much in other fields, and by working together, we could solve problems on a larger scale.
Oh, you have put your finger on one of the most important problems we have, because the most interesting science, I mean, think about what are the 3 areas that are going to be most critical in the country? Energy, the environment, and healthcare. All of those problems require biological scientists, physical scientists, and engineers to all work on them. And it's true, we don't know how to talk to each other. So NSF has a program called the IGERT, Integrated Graduate Education Research Traineeships. And the idea is to do exactly what you're talking about. And I had one of these at West Virginia, and it was taking students who make nanoparticles and putting them together with the students who test nanoparticles and figure out how they interact with people in the environment. Because those 2 groups were working entirely on their own. And so person A would spend 2 years making a nanoparticle and perfecting it, only to find out that the minute they put it in a mouse, it killed the mouse. These people were using commercially available nanoparticles that had a range of shapes, sizes, compositions, and getting results that weren't as particular. Bringing those 2 people together is absolutely critical. And so programs like that are designed to do this. One of the problems we had was that different departments didn't want to give their students credit for courses taken outside their department. And so it's hard enough telling someone in physics to take a course in chemistry, much less take a course in the medical college. And so the departments need to loosen up on that and realize that the problems we're dealing with require this breadth of knowledge. And let your students take some courses in other disciplines. It's really important to do that.
So given that we have a student audience and very interested in continue their education. I wanted to ask if you could tell us what are the best skills that you learned in your education?
The best skills that I learned in my education. The ability to write clearly is probably the thing that we do the worst at with science students. Because understanding something is only half of doing science, communicating it is the other half. And so I think having learned how to write in philosophy was probably the most important thing I learned. The other important thing, and I think being those of us who teach know this, is you can't teach someone unless you know what they already understand. So the skill of listening is incredibly important. Because if I'm talking at you and telling you something, I'll never see that moment when your eyes glaze over and you don't get it. So I would say those are the two most important skills. It's not content. I mean, I switched from doing magnetism to doing nanomedicine. My last biology class was 9th grade. But I was doing biological research because I taught myself the content I needed. The skills, the critical thinking, the communication, the listening to my colleagues, not assuming I knew more than they did because I'm a physicist after all. Those were the important things that let me make that transition.
So if you had, so we have a number of students, it's kind of varied in terms of careers, and some are pre-PhD, some are pre-med. If you kind of had one thing to say to all of them, regardless of the science career that they are choosing to follow, what would that thing be?
Don't worry so much about what other people think. Because I think a lot of times people make decisions and think, I can't do this because I will disappoint my mother, my father, my advisor, my classmates. It's your life, and at some point you have to look at it, and none of those other people will be there when you look at it. So don't worry so much about what other people think. Listen to what your heart is telling you.
Well, Dr. Diandra Leslie-Pelecky, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank all of you.